In my community, girls had their vocal cords cut to keep our voices soft and delicate for our future husbands. I faked the pregnancy to avoid my appointment. When my parents discovered the lie, they pinned me down and scheduled a triple cut for the next morning, one that would leave me completely mute. It was tradition. Girls had their vocal cords partially severed at 13 to ensure our voices stayed gentle and appealing. The procedure took place in a small straw hut with rusted tools that were never sanitized and always without anesthetic. Mine was scheduled for 2 weeks after my 14th birthday. I knew exactly what was coming because I had watched my older sister, Maya, endure it. The night she had her throat cut, our parents threw her a celebration dinner. Maya sat at the table, trying to thank them, but no sound came, only air. Blood had already seeped through the white gauze wrapped around her throat and was dripping onto her dinner plate as she struggled to swallow soup. I asked her quietly, "Did it hurt?" Her face went ghost white. She nodded while trying to scream, but again, nothing came out, just this horrid wheezing rasp as her body shook. 3 weeks later, Maya woke up choking on her own blood. The fragile paper stitches had torn during her sleep. She tried screaming for help, but only gurgled, drawing more blood into her lungs. I found her on the floor of her bedroom, her face turning blue, clawing desperately at her throat. My parents drove her back to the same hut where the procedure had been done. She had to scribble, "Can't breathe," again and again to be understood. The doctor re-stitched her while she sobbed and turned crimson with pain. She had to sleep sitting upright for months, terrified of drowning in her sleep. The worst part came when 3 boys from her school cornered her in the equipment room. They knew she couldn't scream. She came out 20 minutes later, bruised and clothes torn. She wrote everything down, frantic and shaking, but not even our parents believed her. 8 months after her surgery, Maya took her own life. In her note, she said she felt like she was buried alive inside her own body. At her funeral, my mother gave a speech about how Maya was too sensitive and should have embraced the gift of feminine silence like the other girls. All the cut women nodded in agreement, their husbands' hands resting on their shoulders like they were keeping ghosts from floating away. I stood in the back row numb, knowing my own appointment was fast approaching. And then it did. 1 week before the scheduled date, we were having a family barbecue when I noticed my only potential escape, Zane. He was back from college, the son of a close family friend, 19 years old and already eyeing me since I started developing. I waited until he'd had 3 beers, then approached him, brushing his arm, acting like he was everything I'd dreamed of. We ended up at his place. We slept together. It was my first time. Far from romantic or magical, I felt gross and hollow afterward, but it had to be done. 2 days later, I took a pregnancy test and showed it to my mother. Zane had used protection, but I'd swiped a used test with 2 lines from a girl at school who'd pulled the same trick. My mother's face lit up. That evening, she called an emergency family meeting. Everyone agreed Zane, too drunk to remember using a condom, would be a wonderful father and that my surgery would have to be delayed until after the baby was born. I celebrated quietly inside. Phase 1 of my plan had worked. The fake morning sickness gave me freedom. I started going to appointments, which were really secret meetings with other girls who'd been cut. I recorded their testimonies on my phone and hid them in encrypted folders. The silenced girls wrote what they wished they could say. The untouched ones described the dread of waiting for their turn. I knew I only had a few weeks before my parents grew suspicious. I had to work fast. But that's when everything unraveled. I got careless. I left the house in the evening, forgetting my mother would be out too. And as luck or cruelty would have it, she caught me with the other girls. I didn't know right away, but I found out soon enough. When I came home, the first thing my father did was slam me to the kitchen floor. I shouted, asking what was happening, and that's when my mother began pressing and stomping on my bladder until I wet myself.
She used that moment to get another pregnancy test. Of course, this one came back negative, and my parents completely lost it. They sat me down on the couch, took my phone, started combing through it, and then called Zane's parents. By the end of the night, I was covered in bruises. There was another emergency meeting. This time it was about how I'd deceived everyone and how poor Zane had thought he was going to be a father. They made me stand up in front of everyone and apologize to him. At the end of it, my dad made a decision. He saw Zane and his parents out of the house, then turned and shoved me hard against the wall. "If you want to talk so badly," he said, his voice icy, "let's see how you talk after this." He pulled out his phone and dialed. There was a long silence as he waited. Then he said, "Thank you," and hung up. "Your surgery is scheduled for tomorrow. A triple cut, just for you. It hurts a lot more, and you'll never speak again, not even a whisper. So you'll have plenty of time to think about how sorry you are for this little stunt." Then he let go of me, and I fell to the floor. He walked away without looking back. That night, I lay on my bedroom floor. My parents had locked the door from the outside. Every movement sent stabbing pain through my ribs where my father had gripped me too hard. The house was silent, except for the occasional footsteps outside my room, someone checking to make sure I was still inside. Sometime around midnight, I heard a faint scratching at the window. My heart leapt. I thought maybe one of the cut girls had come to help. I dragged myself over and peeked through the curtains, only to see my father had boarded the window shut from the outside. The scratching had been nothing more than a tree branch brushing against the boards in the wind. I reached for my phone, thankful they hadn't thought to take it. But when I tried to access my hidden folders, everything was gone. They'd deleted it all. Months of work, dozens of testimonies, all those girls who trusted me, erased. The doorknob rattled. I froze. My mother's voice came through, muffled, but clear enough to understand. She was talking to someone, likely the doctor, confirming the time of tomorrow's procedure, asking about the recovery period for a triple cut. "No solid food for 2 weeks. We'll supervise her constantly. Yes, we know the bleeding risk. She may struggle. We'll need restraints." A pause. "Sedation? No, we were told she has to stay awake so you can gauge the depth." After they left, I scoured my room for anything useful, but they had already cleaned it out. No scissors, no blades, even my nail file was gone. The window was sealed, the door locked from the outside. I was caged. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about Maya, the way I found her that morning, her fingers clawing at her throat, the note she had left, every word carefully printed because she could no longer say them aloud. I wondered if she had felt the same kind of terror the night before her own procedure. Dawn came too fast. I heard movement downstairs, the clatter of pans, the smell of breakfast wafting through the air. Then other voices, extended family arriving early, reinforcements to make sure I didn't run. The lock clicked. My father appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 of my uncles. I backed away on instinct, but there was nowhere to go. They stepped forward and seized my arms, yanking me upright. My mother entered holding a folded white dress, the traditional one all girls wore to their cutting ceremony. I struggled, but my uncle's hands were like iron. My mother tore off my pajamas and forced the dress over my head. It was Maya's dress, the same one she wore that awful day, still stained despite all the washings. My mother noticed me staring at the faint blotches and gave me a cold, satisfied smile. Downstairs, more family waited. Aunts, cousins, all gathered to witness. Some of the women who had been cut couldn't meet my eyes. Others nodded approvingly like I was finally getting what I deserved. My grandmother sat silent in her usual chair, the thick scar on her own throat a quiet, permanent reminder. They brought out zip ties. My father bound my wrists in front of me, the plastic biting into my skin. My uncles held me steady by the shoulders. No one spoke to me. They talked over me like I was already mute. Just a body being prepared for transport.
Outside, 3 cars were waiting. They weren't taking any risks with me escaping during the drive. I was placed in the middle vehicle, 1 uncle on each side. My parents rode in the lead car, while other relatives followed close behind. The drive to the hut took about 20 minutes.
I watched familiar streets blur past, knowing this might be the last time I saw them as me. Once the triple cut was done, once my voice was stolen for good, I'd be someone else. Something else. We passed the school where I had gathered stories. A few classmates were walking to morning classes, their voices rising and drifting in the breeze. Among them moved cut girls, silent and shadow-like, pieces of themselves lost forever. One of them looked up as we drove past. Her eyes widened when she saw me, dressed in white. The hut appeared beyond the trees, just as I remembered from when we brought Maya. Same slanted, thatched roof, same rough wooden door. A column of smoke curled from the roof vent where they heated the cutting tools over an open flame. My legs buckled when I saw it. I collapsed and my uncles dragged me the rest of the way, my feet scraping along the dirt. Inside, the doctor was already waiting. An elderly man with calm hands and eyes that felt like ice. The same one who had cut Maya, and our mother, and our grandmother. The table stood ready in the center of the room. Leather straps hung off the sides, worn smooth from years of use. The cutting tools lay on a cloth beside it, blades glinting in the light. I could see the 3 distinct knives meant for the triple cut, each one shaped to sever a different part of the vocal cords. My uncles lifted me onto the table. I thrashed, kicked, but they were stronger. The straps wrapped around my arms, legs, and waist. One final band went across my forehead, pinning my head back to expose my throat. I couldn't move, only my eyes. The doctor stepped forward with the first blade. No greeting, no comfort. This was just another procedure to him, just another girl to silence. He pressed his fingers to my throat, searching for the right spot. That's when we heard the commotion outside. Voices, shouting, car doors slamming. My father turned toward the noise, irritated, and went to investigate. Through the open doorway, I saw them. Cars pulling up in the clearing, dozens, parents climbing out, and with them daughters, cut girls, wearing their school uniforms, silent but standing tall. One mother was shouting at my father, waving papers in his face. More families poured in. At least 15 cars filled the small space outside the hut. The girls gathered together, forming a quiet wall of defiance. My father tried to shove past them. The mothers wouldn't move. They kept pushing those documents at him. I pulled against the straps, trying to see more. The doctor paused, knife still in hand, distracted. Then I saw her. Elena, one of the first girls I had ever interviewed, stood in the crowd, holding something in the air. My phone. My phone! But how? My parents had erased everything. The noise outside grew louder. Some fathers now joined in, their voices raised in confusion and anger. My uncles abandoned their posts to join the chaos, leaving only my mother in the hut with the doctor and me. Her face had gone pale. Elena's mother broke through the crowd, storming toward the hut. My mother tried to block her, but others followed. The tiny room quickly overflowed with bodies. The doctor stepped back, clearly unsure what to do. Elena lifted the phone high, and then I heard it. My voice. Playing over the speaker. The recordings, they were still there, all of them. Not just mine, but the others, every girl, their testimonies, their trauma, their pain. One by one, the girls' stories played aloud. Accounts of surgeries, of complications, of abuse, of loss. The girls outside stood straighter with every word, the silence they had been forced into now thundering in the air. Parents' expressions changed, from confusion to anger to horror. My mother lunged for the phone, but Elena's mom caught her wrist. Other parents raised their own phones, filming the confrontation. The doctor tried to slip away, but the doorway was now blocked by fathers, and they didn't look at him the same way anymore. Strapped to the table, I couldn't speak, but I didn't have to. My work had reached them. My voice had made it. Not in the way I imagined, but at the exact moment they tried to erase me, they heard me louder than ever. The recordings kept going, one voice after another. Some parents wept, others shouted at my father, at the doctor, at the tradition they had once defended. Elena's mother stepped forward and began to undo my straps.
My mother protested, but other women held her back. As each strap was undone, I felt something returning. Possibility. The final strap was the one across my forehead. When it came off, I slowly sat up. My throat was still untouched. The hut erupted into chaos. Parents were shouting at the doctor, who backed toward the door, eyes darting like a trapped animal. My father barked about tradition, about respect, about the sacredness of feminine silence. But his words were drowned out by the flood of testimonies still playing. The voices of silenced girls filled the space, louder now than they had ever been. I slid off the table, my legs trembling. Elena reached for my arm, steadying me. She made a hand motion I didn't understand, but her mother stepped in and translated. Elena had backed up everything to cloud storage the day I'd first shown her the recordings. When she saw our convoy pass by the school that morning, she knew what was happening. The confrontation spilled outside as more cars arrived. Word had spread. Parents who had never dared question the tradition were hearing for the first time their own daughter's pain. The cut girls stood together, no longer alone, no longer invisible. Their silence was now their shield and their power. My father tried to come for me, but a line of mothers blocked his path. My own mother just stood frozen, staring at the wreckage of her perfect world. The doctor had vanished, his tools left behind on the blood-stained table. As the sun climbed overhead, the clearing filled with more families. The recordings had ended, but the voices hadn't. Parents wept as they apologized. Cut girls signed rapidly to one another, finally free to speak their truths in the only language left to them. I stood in the middle of it all, still wearing my sister Maya's stained white dress, my voice still mine, my throat whole. The blade meant for the triple cut lay forgotten in the dirt, untouched. Around me voices rose, not in fury now, but in purpose. What had once been tradition was now being held to account. But I knew this was only the beginning. My father's glare said everything. The doctor might have vanished, but there were still other huts, other families, other girls waiting their turn. This wasn't over. It had barely begun. The crowd thickened. My father finally forced his way through the ring of women. His face was red with rage. He grabbed my arm hard and yanked me toward our car. But Elena's mother stepped in between us. More women joined her, forming a circle around me, shielding me with their bodies. Their daughters watched behind, some crying, some signing messages too fast for me to follow. My father's grip tightened until I winced. He pulled harder, dragging me forward until 3 men stepped in. Fathers. They spoke to him in low, firm voices, pointing back toward the hut. Inside, others had begun photographing the abandoned tools, the doctor's legacy documented at last. Elena and her mother approached again. She handed me a jacket to cover the white dress. Her fingers moved fast, more signing. Her mother translated. Elena had uploaded everything to multiple cloud accounts. When she saw us driving away that morning, she'd sent the files to every parent she could reach. Then my mother emerged from the hut, no longer composed, her face pale, her steps unsteady. She walked directly to my father and whispered something that made his jaw tighten. Slowly, he let go of my wrist. He turned to speak, but the crowd had already formed. Dozens of angry parents stood in his way. Some held their daughters protectively. Others demanded answers. The confrontation boiled over when one father shoved mine backward. My uncles moved to defend him, but they were outnumbered now. The crowd had swelled to nearly 50. More families kept arriving by the minute. Word was spreading far beyond this one village. I felt lightheaded, shaken by the sudden change. Just moments ago, I had been strapped down, waiting to be silenced forever. Now I stood, whole, surrounded by people who had finally heard the truth. But the look in my father's eyes said it plainly. He wasn't finished. He retreated with my mother and uncles to their car, faces grim, never looking away from me. Elena's mother offered to drive me somewhere safe. I thanked her, but I shook my head. Running would only buy time. He would find me again, and next time the punishment would be worse. Instead, I asked her to help me gather the girls who had shared their testimonies.
We needed to plan our next steps. The crowd slowly began to break apart, families heading back to their cars. Some argued, others walked away in heavy silence. But something had shifted, and this time, the silence was ours to control.
The cut girls signed to one another before being led away, their eyes carrying a new kind of hope. The hut stood silent now, its door hanging open like a wound left exposed. Elena and 5 other girls stayed behind with their mothers. We gathered in a small circle, away from the remaining cars. As I explained how I had collected the testimonies and why I had staged the fake pregnancy, the mothers listened closely. Their faces reflected both admiration and deep concern. One of them suggested going to the authorities, but that idea was quickly dismissed. In our community, problems were handled internally. Involving outsiders could make everything worse. Another mother proposed confronting the village elders, but we all knew that would go nowhere. The elders were the ones who'd brought the doctor here in the first place, decades ago. They were the keepers of the tradition, not its challengers. While we debated options, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "Come home immediately. Your father is waiting." The blood drained from my face. The other girls noticed and instinctively moved closer, forming a tight huddle around me. Their mothers exchanged glances, worry creasing their features. Elena's mother insisted on driving me home, and 3 other mothers followed in their cars. When we pulled up, my father was already waiting on the porch, arms crossed. His calm expression was more terrifying than his previous rage. Inside, the living room was full. My extended family had gathered. Grandmothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, all turning to watch as I entered, flanked by the mothers who had refused to leave me alone. My father gestured toward a chair in the center of the room. I sat, feeling the weight of every eye on me, like a trial with no judge, no jury, just sentence. My grandmother spoke first. She spoke of honor, tradition, and virtue, of how the cutting had been practiced for generations, how it shaped obedient daughters and dignified wives. Her fingers brushed the scar on her neck as if to underscore her point. The others nodded along, faces stone stiff. Then my father began pacing around my chair. He spoke of betrayal, of shame, of the disruption I had caused, of Maya and how she'd been too fragile to accept her duty, how I was walking her same path. My hands clenched in my lap. Elena's mother stepped forward to speak, but my father silenced her with a single cold glare. Family matter. The other mothers remained, quiet, tense. Their presence was the only shield I had. Then came the ultimatum. My father announced that I had 2 choices: submit to the triple cut the next morning, or be cast out. No contact, no money, no home, no family. Total exile. Silence fell heavy. I looked around the room. Some faces showed uncertainty. Others were firm. My mother wouldn't look up from the floor. My grandmother nodded sullenly, pleased. The others who bore scars unconsciously touched their throats. Then Elena's mother stepped forward to offer to take me in if I chose exile. The other mothers echoed her, one by one. My father's face darkened. He reminded them, anyone who took me in would bring the same consequences on their own families. Exile by association. The meeting ended with no resolution. My father gave me until sunrise to decide. The mothers left reluctantly, but not before making me promise I'd call if I needed anything. I was escorted to my room again, this time locked in, with boards nailed across the inside of the window as well. I sat on my bed, weighing the impossible. Lose my voice forever, or lose everything I had ever known. Either way, I would never be the same. The house settled into an uneasy stillness as relatives found places to sleep. I knew they weren't resting for long. They were just there to make sure I didn't run. At 2 a.m., I heard a soft tapping on my wall. It was too rhythmic to be random. A code. I pressed my ear to the plaster. More tapping came from the other side. Someone was trying to communicate. I tapped back, but I didn't know any codes. The tapping changed, more insistent. Then a whisper. "Sophia." It was my cousin Nadia, one of the few uncut girls in our extended family. She was 15, her procedure scheduled for next month. We spoke in soft whispers broken by tapping.
Nadia told me things I hadn't expected to hear. The testimonies had shaken people. Some relatives were starting to doubt the tradition. Her own mother had been crying in the bathroom earlier that evening. 2 aunts had been arguing with their husbands behind closed doors. The family was not as united as my father believed. Nadia had overheard my uncles making plans. They were taking turns standing watch outside my door. In the morning, they'd escort me either to the hut or to the edge of town, depending on my decision.
There would be no chance for a last-minute escape. Nadia also brought disturbing news. The doctor hadn't fled. He was staying with another family nearby, waiting. My father had paid him extra to remain on standby. If I chose the cutting, it would happen, community support or not. We whispered until just before dawn, going silent the moment footsteps creaked in the hallway. I lay back down and closed my eyes, pretending to sleep, though my thoughts were frantic. The testimonies had created cracks in our community's foundation, but they wouldn't widen fast enough to save me. As pale gray light filtered through the gaps in the boarded window, I heard stirring throughout the house. Relatives waking, preparing. The scent of breakfast drifted in under the door, but my stomach twisted too tightly to feel hunger. The lock clicked. My father entered with 2 uncles behind him. His face betrayed nothing, calm, cold. He asked for my decision. I rose on trembling legs, still dressed in the white fabric marked with faint, unwashed stains. The moment stretched between us, heavy and sharp like a knife. "I choose exile," I said. He nodded once. No surprise, no argument. He turned to leave, but I stopped him. "I have conditions," I said. I wanted time to pack, I wanted to say goodbye to my mother, and I wanted to walk out the front door with dignity, not be dragged away like garbage. His jaw clenched, but he agreed. 1 hour, supervised. My uncles would ensure I only packed personal clothing and essentials. No heirlooms, no photos, nothing that tied me to the bloodline I was abandoning. My mother appeared in the doorway while I packed clothes into a worn duffel, her face unreadable. When I zipped the bag, she approached and adjusted my collar. Her hands trembled slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but said nothing. She turned and left. Downstairs, the family had gathered, a wall of faces stretching from the bottom of the stairs to the door, a silent gauntlet. Some relatives wouldn't meet my eyes. Others glared with disdain. My grandmother spit at my feet. At the front door, my father stood with an envelope. Inside, just enough cash for a bus ticket and a few nights at a cheap motel. Nothing more. He made his final warning clear. Any relative who helped me would be cut off, just like me. I took the envelope and I walked out. The morning air touched my face, cool, sharp, clean. Behind me, the door shut with a solid click. And just like that, I was no longer part of the family that had shaped my entire life. But I wasn't alone. At the end of the driveway, Elena waited, with her mother and several other families. They'd stood watch all night, in shifts, making sure no one forced me to the hut. Now they formed a shield around me. Elena's mother took my bag and led me to her car. The other parents clustered around us, forming a buffer between me and the house I'd grown up in. As we drove away, I looked back once. My father stood at the window. Our eyes met. Then he turned away. The next few days blurred together. Elena's family gave me a room, food, space to think. We began planning. But word of my exile spread fast. Some families supported my father's decision. Others whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, the tradition wasn't worth destroying families over. And then more girls came forward. Not just from our town, but from neighboring villages, places where the cutting was still quietly practiced.
The recordings had traveled far and wide, shared in secret, then in groups, then openly. For the first time in generations, people were talking. Support groups formed in kitchens and on back patios. People gathered in hushed circles. Some cried, some listened, some asked questions they never dared to ask before. But the backlash came just as quickly. Traditional families closed ranks. Girls were rushed into early procedures. Some disappeared from school, returning days later with bandaged throats and hollow eyes. The doctor had no shortage of work. My father's influence stretched beyond bloodlines. Businesses owned by relatives began to refuse to serve families that had sheltered me. Children were pulled from schools where teachers had spoken against the cutting. The entire community began to fracture along fault lines that had always been there, but were now impossible to ignore. Elena and I spent hours planning. The testimonies had opened a door, but it wasn't enough. Stories sparked awareness, but we needed proof. Proof that even traditional families were wavering. Proof that the cutting was not just cruel, but unnecessary. Then, one quiet evening, Nadia showed up at Elena's house. She'd snuck out, risking exile herself, just to bring news.
Several younger cousins were starting to resist their scheduled procedures, but they didn't know how. The fake pregnancy trick had already circulated widely. It was no longer effective. They needed new strategies. So, we built them. A network of safe houses, spare rooms, hidden basements offered by parents quietly sympathetic to our cause. It wasn't perfect, but it bought time. Time for girls to escape. Time for families to reconsider. Our first real test came when Nadia's appointment arrived. Her parents woke up to an empty bed and a note explaining her choice. Panic erupted. The entire family went into crisis. Search parties were formed. My father led them, determined to find her, certain she was being sheltered by my allies. For 2 weeks, Nadia rotated between 3 different homes. Every time searchers got close, she moved. It took a toll on everyone involved. Some families pulled away, afraid of the growing pressure. The community's backlash was no longer just social, it was personal, threatening livelihoods and reputations. During that tense stretch, I got a message through Elena. It was from my mother. She wanted to meet. Alone. It reeked of a trap. But something about her words gave me pause. There was no scolding in her message, no bitterness. Only weariness. Elena's mother offered to drive me, staying nearby in case anything went wrong. We met at a quiet park on the edge of town. She was already sitting on a bench, hands folded, her posture tense but tired. She looked smaller somehow, older, like the strain of everything had weathered her from the inside out. When she saw me, her composure faltered. She started talking about Maya, things I'd never known, how Maya had begged to delay her cutting, how she had tried to run the night before, how both my parents had dismissed her panic as childish. My mother's voice cracked as she admitted she had wondered in the quiet hours whether things could have been different. Then she got to the real reason she had come. My grandmother was dying. The family matriarch, the woman who had enforced every tradition, the one who spit at me during my exile. She wanted to see me. I was stunned. It didn't make sense, but my mother swore it was genuine. My grandmother had been listening, really listening, to the recordings, to the testimonies. Some were from her own generation. She'd been shaken. The meeting would have to be secret. My father couldn't know. We made plans for 3 nights later when he'd be traveling to meet with other conservative family heads. My mother would signal when it was safe to enter. Those 3 days dragged. Nadia remained hidden. 2 more girls joined the network, fleeing their own appointments. Our resources stretched thinner with every rescued voice. The community was dividing, and the line between sides was getting clearer. When the night came, Elena's mother drove me to my old neighborhood and parked several blocks away. I walked the familiar streets with my hood pulled up, a ghost passing through the remnants of a former life. Then the porch light flicked twice. Inside, the house felt different, smaller, darker. My mother led me upstairs to my grandmother's room. The old woman lay propped up by pillows, her breathing strained. The scar across her throat seemed deeper than I remembered. She beckoned me closer. Her voice was hoarse, worn down by decades of forcing words through damaged vocal cords. She told me about her own cutting, at age 12, how she had fought, how her own mother had held her down, how she had spent weeks in agony as infection spread through her throat. Then she spoke of Maya, of the guilt she carried, how she'd seen the pain but said nothing, how she convinced herself silence was sacred, that suffering meant strength, how Maya's death planted the first seed of doubt she had ever known. From under her pillow, she pulled a small wooden box. Inside were old photographs, girls with the same scars, her sisters, cousins, friends. Some had died from infections, others had taken their own lives, all silenced in the name of virtue. She pressed my hand with surprising strength, asked me to continue what I had started, to make sure fewer girls met the same fate. And then she told me something that reframed everything. The doctor? He wasn't just a community practitioner. He was her nephew, trained by her own father. The cutting tradition in our community hadn't just existed. It had been preserved by our own family line. The blades, the ceremonies, the tools, the ideology, all of it, passed down through our bloodline like a legacy. My father's fury, his obsession with control, wasn't just about tradition. It was about power, about protecting a legacy that had made us the gatekeepers of generational silence.
It was about protecting a family legacy built on mutilation. My exile hadn't just been punishment. It was an attempt to silence the one voice that could unravel the truth. My grandmother handed me more documents from the box, pages that shattered any illusions, records of payments, names of girls who had died, letters from desperate families pleading for mercy that was never granted, evidence that the practice had never been about virtue. It had always been about control. I left through the back door, while my mother kept watch. My steps were heavy with the weight of what I now knew. Elena's mother noticed it the moment I got in the car. I told her everything on the drive back. Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as the full scope came into focus. We called an emergency meeting with our closest supporters. The documents changed everything. This wasn't just a movement to end a harmful ritual. It was now about exposing generations of intentional exploitation, enabled, guarded, and perpetuated by my family. The stakes had risen. Some supporters withdrew, afraid of being caught in the fallout, but others became more resolute than ever. The documents gave us power, but also made us targets. We knew my father would do anything to bury this. In the days that followed, we documented everything carefully, made copies, distributed them to allies we trusted beyond question. Elena's mother, with her clinic background, cross-checked the medical records. The patterns of deaths and complications were undeniable. Meanwhile, Nadia's situation became urgent. Her parents had offered a cash reward for any information leading to her capture. Someone talked. She had to escape in the middle of the night as searchers closed in around the safe house. We barely got her out. The close call shook us all. Some safe houses shut down. Others imposed tighter security protocols. The network started to strain. Girls hiding began to question whether staying was worth the risk. Then, Elena found something critical. While reviewing the documents, she discovered that the tradition wasn't as ancient as everyone claimed. It had only existed for 4 generations. Started by my great-great-grandfather, a traveling merchant who had imported the practice from a distant region where it was already dying out. It hadn't been born of sacred values. It had been adopted for power. The idea that this sacred custom was really a century-old import, sustained by one bloodline's greed, sent shockwaves through our network. Resistance reignited. My father must have sensed the shift. He called a mandatory community meeting at the town's largest hall. Every traditional family was expected to attend. With the full weight of legacy behind him, he planned to reassert control. but we were ready. Elena and her tech-savvy friends had worked night and day. They created anonymous online channels for cut girls to post their stories. They had digitized all the documents. The entire archive was ready to go public, immediately, if things went south. The night before the meeting, I received a message from my father. This time, it was direct. He wanted to negotiate. He implied he knew about my grandmother's betrayal. He offered a path back if I agreed to surrender all the documents and publicly endorse the tradition. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to bargain. Too many girls had suffered. Too many lives had been silenced. The truth was no longer mine to keep or trade. Elena's family stepped up security around the house. The morning of the meeting was thick with tension. Families walked to the hall in small, separate groups, each one already aligned. Cut girls moved quietly beside their husbands. Uncut girls clung to their mothers' hands, sensing the weight of the moment. We watched from a distance as the building filled. My father stood at the entrance, greeting people with a carefully rehearsed smile. The doctor was there too, skulking in the corner like a shadow. They looked confident, but there was tension in every movement. Inside, our allies relayed updates by text. My father spoke for over an hour. He called me a corrupted daughter, claimed I'd been poisoned by foreign ideas. He insisted the testimonies were exaggerated. Complications were rare, he said. The cutting was sacred. Then he called for unity, to stand against those who would destroy their way of life. But the cracks formed immediately. When he opened the floor for questions, dozens of hands rose. Parents wanted to know about the deaths mentioned in the testimonies. They asked why the doctor used unsterilized tools. They questioned whether any tradition could justify risking their daughters' lives.
My father struggled to keep control. He dismissed the rising concerns as hysteria. He warned of consequences for families that wavered. But the force behind his words was gone, emptied out by the testimonies too many had now heard. Too many parents had looked into their daughters' eyes and finally recognized the fear. Then, someone played a recording. My grandmother's voice, frail but unmistakably clear, filled the hall, confessing the family's secret. The room exploded. My father tried to yell over the growing uproar, but it was too late. More phones were held aloft. The voices of girls, cut and silenced, echoed through the space from dozens of devices. Their words, once hidden in the dark, now rang louder than his ever could. The doctor tried to slip away, but found his path blocked. Parents who had lost daughters stepped in his way, demanding explanations. Others shouted at him, at my father, wanting to know how much my family had gained from their children's suffering. The meeting disintegrated into a storm of accusations and raw revelation. My father retreated from the stage, his carefully constructed image unraveling in real time. The so-called unity of tradition shattered like glass. Outside, we followed everything through our network of allies inside the building. Emotions ran high, but the confrontation never turned violent. Some traditional families stormed out in protest. Others stayed, arguing bitterly for what they believed in. But the community, once obedient and silent, would never be the same again. As the crowd finally broke apart, groups gathered in the street. Parents apologized to their cut daughters. Families scheduled for upcoming procedures publicly declared cancellations. The doctor's car was found abandoned. He'd fled on foot when the tide turned. But even that didn't feel like victory, because it wasn't over. My father and his closest loyalists retreated to our family home, already plotting their next move. The ritual might be dying, but its defenders still had power, and they would not surrender easily. That night, Elena's home overflowed with supporters celebrating what felt like a turning point. Laughter, tears, relief filled the air, but I couldn't join in fully. A knot of unease stayed with me. We'd won a battle, not the war. My father still had influence, connections, wealth, and he was angry. I was right to worry. The next morning, reports came in. Businesses owned by outspoken families had been vandalized overnight. Others received threatening notes shoved through their doors. His network was smaller now, but still dangerous. The community had split, openly. Elena and I knew what had come next. We released everything.
The documents, the testimonies, the truth about our family's role in preserving the practice, not just in our town, but in surrounding regions. We created anonymous accounts and began posting to online forums where similar customs still thrived under the radar. The response was immediate. Messages flooded in. Girls from neighboring towns, even other provinces. They shared their stories, their fears, their desperation to resist. Parents who had once been unsure found strength in what our community had done. The movement spread. My father retaliated hard. He filed official complaints, accusing me of stealing family property. He accused families who had hidden girls of abduction. He leveraged every favor and connection to disrupt the lives of anyone who had taken a stand. But for every strike, the resistance grew. The testimonies had cracked something open, something buried for generations. Mothers who had once been cut began talking to their daughters honestly. For the first time, truth replaced shame. And silence, once the protector of the ritual, became its executioner. Nadia finally emerged from hiding when her parents announced they had changed their minds. They would not go through with her procedure. A small victory, but a deeply symbolic one. Others followed. Cancellations cascaded. One by one, appointments disappeared. The doctor found himself with no clients and no income. Boycott spread. My father's business suffered. His reputation, once a symbol of authority, now carried a stain too deep to scrub clean. Traditionalists began to wonder if their devotion was worth the damage. The tight grip began to loosen. Cracks spread through their once solid front. 3 months after my exile, I stood once again outside the home where I had grown up. But this time, I wasn't alone. Dozens of girls stood beside me, and their families. We had gathered, not to protest, but for something better. A ceremony. One that Elena had envisioned. A celebration of voices reclaimed. Cut girls signed their words, hands speaking what mouths could not. Uncut girls sang songs that had once been forbidden. The air pulsed with defiance and healing. It was a reclamation of identity, of autonomy, of life. From the window, I saw my father watching the crowd. He was alone now. Even his brothers had stepped back, uncertain and tired of fighting a losing battle.
My uncles had daughters too, and the testimonies had gotten to them. The family that had upheld the cutting tradition for 4 generations was coming apart. As the sun dipped low, candles were lit. One for each girl who had died from complications, for those who had taken their own lives, for Maya, whose death had ignited my rebellion. The flames flickered like echoes of voices once stolen, now rising again. Then something none of us expected happened. My mother stepped out onto the porch of our old home and walked through the crowd. Her face was streaked with tears. In her hands, my grandmother's box of documents, and something else, a thick envelope. She came to me. Inside that envelope were records even older than the ones we'd uncovered, payment ledgers, punishment orders, names of families who had tried to resist and were silenced. Proof that it had always been about power and profit, not protection, not virtue. She had spent months collecting it all, quietly, determined. Then, for the first time, she spoke publicly. She told the crowd about her own cutting, the infection that nearly killed her, the pain she endured every time she swallowed, the children she lost because she couldn't scream during childbirth complications. Her voice was fragile, worn, but steady. One by one, other cut women stepped forward. They signed their stories, hands shaking. Daughters translated aloud. The gathering transformed, no longer just a ceremony. It became a living, breathing archive of pain, strength, and survival. Even families who still supported the practice stood on their porches and listened. Some quietly wept, others simply didn't look away. When night fully settled, the crowd dispersed. There had been no shouting, no threats, no confrontation, just voices, and that made all the difference. The healing had begun. In the following weeks, more families abandoned the tradition. Procedures were canceled. The doctor never came back. Eventually, his instruments were collected and burned in a public bonfire, attended by hundreds. My father's influence evaporated. His business failed. His allies disappeared. Elena's family helped me apply to educational programs in the city. Others in exile received similar help. We weren't being cast out anymore. We were leaving. Not as pariahs, but as pioneers, carrying our stories into new spaces where they could fuel more change. The night before I left, there was a knock on Elena's door. It was my father. He looked smaller, hollowed by defeat. He didn't apologize, didn't ask for understanding. He simply handed me a letter and walked away. I opened it alone. Inside was the deed to my grandmother's house and a single line written beneath it. The legacy is yours now. Shape it or destroy it. He was leaving town. He couldn't bear to watch what he'd lost. The guardian of silence had finally been silenced by the very voices he tried to erase. As the bus pulled away from everything I'd ever known, I thought of Maya. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. The ritual that killed her was crumbling, and the ripples of resistance we had created were still spreading. Elena stood on the platform, waving, already planning the next phase. We had contacts in 3 neighboring regions where similar practices still existed. The testimonies would travel. The movement would grow. No more girls would be forced into silence. The cutting tradition had survived on shadows and quiet. But we had learned something vital. When voices rise together, they are unstoppable. My exile had become my liberation. My family's legacy of harm would end with me. As the familiar streets faded into the distance, I reached up and touched my throat, whole, intact, ready to speak for those who still couldn't. The real work was just beginning. But for the first time in generations, the girls from my community could face their future with their voices still their own. At the bus station, it was nearly empty when Elena's mother dropped me off. She pressed some extra cash into my hand before I could protest, then left quickly. I stood with my one worn bag, watching other passengers gather for the morning departure. My phone buzzed, messages from the network. 3 more girls had gone into hiding overnight. Their parents had moved their procedures up after hearing about the ceremony. I typed out quick replies, connecting them with safe houses. But my attention shifted to movement across the street. A familiar car sat parked just beyond the corner. My uncle. Watching the station, probably under my father's orders. I ducked behind a pillar and waited. 20 minutes passed. Then he pulled away, likely assuming I had already left. The bus arrived late.
I found a seat near the back of the bus and settled in for the 6-hour ride to the city. Around me, other passengers chatted quietly, but I kept to myself, scrolling through apartment listings Elena had sent. Most were far out of my price range, even after selling my grandmother's jewelry. About halfway through the trip, the bus stopped at a roadside station. I stepped out to stretch my legs and froze. By the vending machines stood Marcus, my cousin, one of my father's most loyal followers. He pretended to study the snacks, but his eyes kept drifting toward me. Keeping calm, I walked to the restroom and locked myself in a stall. My hands trembled as I messaged Elena. She replied instantly, with a plan. A friend of hers lived in the next town and could pick me up if I got off early. I returned to the bus and kept my head low. Through the window, I watched Marcus on the phone, no doubt reporting my location. When we reached the next stop, I slipped off the bus in a crowd of passengers and spotted a beat-up sedan idling by the curb. Elena's friend waved me over. We drove winding back roads for an hour before she dropped me at a different bus station, one far from any place my family would think to check. There, I bought a ticket to an entirely different city, doubling back on my route to throw off any tail. The second bus was nearly empty. I dozed in short bursts, jerking awake at every stop to scan for familiar faces. By nightfall, the city skyline finally rose in the distance. Towering, overwhelming, a world apart from everything I'd ever known. The address Elena had given me led to a weathered building near the university district. The landlady, an old friend of Elena's aunt, showed me a cramped studio with water-stained ceilings and peeling walls, but it had a working lock, and it was far away from anyone who knew my name.
I paid for 2 weeks up front and collapsed on the thin mattress. My phone buzzed continuously, messages pouring in from the network. Girls from communities I'd never heard of shared their stories, their plans, their fears. By morning, new challenges had surfaced. The education program Alina had told me about required documents I didn't have. My father had kept everything locked up, transcripts, health records, even my birth certificate. I spent hours at the admissions office explaining my story to increasingly empathetic staff. They'd never dealt with someone fleeing forced vocal cord mutilation, but they recognized what desperation looked like. One counselor made calls, pulled strings, found loopholes in the rules. While I waited for approval, I found work washing dishes at a diner near campus. The manager didn't ask about references. I didn't offer any. 10-hour shifts, hands raw from harsh soap, but I was thankful for the monotony. It gave my mind something else to focus on. 2 weeks passed like that. Work, sleep, network updates, repeat. Elena visited once, bringing updates from home. More families had rejected the tradition. My father's business had shuttered. The doctor had vanished. But not everything was hopeful. 3 girls had been found and forcibly cut after their hiding spots were exposed. One suffered severe complications. Her parents, longtime defenders of the tradition, were now faced with their daughter's permanent injury. It was a bitter, cruel irony. During a shift one day, my phone rang. Unknown number. I nearly let it go, but instinct told me to answer. My mother's voice came through, faint over the kitchen clatter. She spoke quickly, her tone urgent. My father had left town. No one knew where he'd gone. She wanted to send me my documents. I gave her the address of the restaurant, not my apartment. I still couldn't trust her completely. 3 days later, the package arrived. Birth certificate, transcripts, medical files, everything I'd need to enroll. And something I hadn't expected. Photos of Maya, ones I'd never seen. Her smiling, her laughing, alive. The education program accepted me for the spring semester. Basic classes first to make up for lost time, followed by vocational training. The counselor helped me apply for financial aid. It covered tuition, but not rent or food. I picked up more shifts, sometimes working 16 hours straight. My body ached constantly, but every paycheck meant another week of safety. More girls reached out, curious about how I'd made it out. I shared what I could. Tips, contacts, quiet places to stay. The network was no longer a lifeline just for our town. It was becoming a guide for others, too. Then, Elena called with news I'd been dreading. My father had been seen. He was in a nearby community, one where the cutting tradition still held strong. He was meeting with their leaders, possibly trying to reestablish himself.
The man who had lost everything still clung to his beliefs. A month into life in the city, I ran into a new kind of resistance. Word of my background, of the tradition I'd defied, somehow made its way into the community here. One day, the restaurant owner's wife confronted her husband after hearing gossip from someone with ties to our region. She demanded he fire me, claiming I brought shame and dishonor to their business. He refused. But the atmosphere changed overnight. Conversations paused when I entered the room. Coworkers whispered behind my back. Someone left anonymous notes in my locker, accusing me of defiling myself to escape the tradition. Still, I stayed. I needed the job. The network continued growing. We'd launched a simple website with practical resources, guides for escape, safe house contacts, job listings in distant cities, emergency transportation options. The site's traffic climbed every day, spreading through private chats and encrypted forums. I started my studies in the middle of that chaos. Sitting in classrooms beside students who'd never feared losing their voices felt like stepping into a dream. They complained about essays and early lectures. I clutched each assignment like a lifeline. To me, school wasn't an obligation, it was liberation. 3 months after I arrived, I opened my apartment door to find Nadia standing there, eyes swollen and clothes wrinkled from the road. She'd run, literally, after her parents tried to force her into the procedure. climbed out a bathroom window, and hitchhiked to the city with nothing but determination. I gave her my bed, slept on the floor. The next morning, we repeated the cycle I'd already lived: restaurant leads, enrollment, documentation workarounds, connecting her to the network. She wasn't the last. One by one, girls followed the trail we'd carved. My father resurfaced again through the network updates. He'd embedded himself in a traditionalist community and positioned himself as their unofficial spokesman. His speeches became increasingly extreme, branding resistors as diseased, corrupted, dangerous. Even his supporters began to flinch at his words. Back in the city, I lost my restaurant job. The owner's wife finally won that fight. I moved on to a factory, then a cleaning service. Each job paid less. Each rejection seemed to follow whispers passed between community networks. But I kept going. I studied, I worked, I answered every message from girls reaching out in fear. 6 months after my exile, Elena came for a longer visit. She brought photos from home. The hut was gone, demolished. In its place stood a memorial garden. My mother had led the project, her voice finally rising after decades of silence. That night, Elena and I sat up updating the website. We posted stories from new communities. Some had banned the cutting outright, others transformed it into symbolic ceremonies with no physical harm. Progress was slow, but it was real. When my first semester grades arrived, straight A's, I almost didn't believe it. My counselor urged me to consider applying to university once I completed the program. It felt impossibly ambitious, but I'd learned to stop dismissing impossible things. Nadia found her footing too. She worked part-time at a bookstore near campus, splitting an apartment with 2 other exiled girls. They called themselves a chosen family. They cooked together, cried together, survived together. The network expanded beyond our capacity to manage alone. Elena brought in tech-minded friends to help with the website. Former cut girls who had learned sign language recorded their testimonies in video format. The movement was growing beyond anything we had imagined. Meanwhile, my father's influence became more disturbing. He pushed communities to speed up their cutting schedules. Girls as young as 11 were being subjected to the procedure. Even some traditional families began to question him. I focused on what I could control: school, survival, and helping girls find safe landings in the city. Each new arrival was a victory. Each family that hesitated or canceled a procedure was a quiet revolution. The work was relentless, but necessary. Then, winter came. Heating bills soared. Several girls in the network came close to losing their homes. We pooled what little we had, sharing apartments, taking turns paying rent, sleeping in shifts to conserve warmth. That's when an unexpected ally appeared. A university professor reached out after hearing whispers about our work. Her grandmother had been cut in another country decades ago. She offered us a private meeting space, research support, and, most importantly, connections. Through her, we gained access to refugee assistance programs, legal aid, and organizations that could help girls obtain official documentation.
Many of the girls had fled without proper identification. Lawyers stepped forward to help, volunteering time to establish legal identities, secure work permits, and navigate the maze of bureaucracies that often felt designed to keep us out. My second semester began with cautious hope. The vocational program placed me in an internship at a small medical clinic. Real experience, a real future. I worked mornings at the clinic, attended classes in the afternoons, and cleaned offices at night. It was exhausting, but it was progress. Elena kept me updated on what was happening back home. The community had officially banned the cutting tradition. My father's supporters had dwindled to a few bitter hardliners. Even my mother had stepped into the light, publicly denouncing the practice and speaking at community meetings. She shared her story, her pain, her silence. But our victory was not universal. Other communities clung tightly to the tradition. Girls still vanished from classrooms, returning days later voiceless, their throats wrapped in gauze. Our network received desperate messages daily.
We saved who we could, mourned those we couldn't. My father made one final push for relevance. He published a manifesto, rambling and conspiratorial, filled with claims of foreign corruption and cultural decay. Most dismissed it as the rantings of a broken man, but extremists took notice. I ignored it. Final exams were coming. The clinic offered me a part-time position after graduation. It wasn't much, but it meant I could finally leave the cleaning job. Each small step forward felt like a mountain climbed. Nadia finished her program first. She had studied early childhood education, determined to teach little girls that their voices were worth keeping. Her job placement was in another city, but we celebrated before she left. Another success story. Another life reclaimed. Our website traffic exploded. Girls from countries we'd never even heard of reached out. Different traditions, different names, but the same cruelty, the same silencing. Our small resistance had tapped into something far bigger. Change wasn't just possible, it had begun. Graduation came quietly, no big ceremony. Elena and her mother were there, along with several girls from the network. Afterward, we gathered in my apartment, sharing cheap food and cheaper wine. Survivors, celebrating survival. The clinic job brought something I'd never known before: stability. Regular hours, reliable income, health insurance. I moved into a better apartment. No mold, no broken locks, no water stains. Just a door that shut and a bed that was mine. More girls kept arriving each month, following the path we'd carved. The network had grown into an informal underground railroad. Safe houses, bus passes, job leads, school contacts. We had built what we had once needed. My father faded further into irrelevance. Reports placed him in remote towns, preaching to dwindling crowds. The tradition he had once defended with such fury was withering, not quickly, but undeniably. His legacy was its destruction. 2 years after my exile, I stood at the front of a classroom of nursing students. The professor had asked me to speak about cultural medical practices. I touched my throat, still intact, and told my story. Their faces mirrored the horror I once carried. After class, a few students stayed behind to talk. One told me her community still practiced female circumcision. Another spoke of foot binding in her grandmother's generation. The cutting of voices was just one manifestation. There were others, still too many. Our network had become something larger, a real organization. Elena ran it full-time now, supported by grants and small donations. We helped over 300 girls escape harmful traditions across different countries. Every success stood on the shoulders of the last. My mother came to visit for my birthday. We met at a quiet restaurant, neutral ground. Trust between us was still under construction. She brought photos of the memorial garden where the cutting hut had once stood. Flowers now bloomed where blood had once seeped into dirt. A symbol of beauty rising from brutality. She told me my father had reached out. He was ill, maybe dying. He wanted forgiveness. She never told him where I was. The man who had tried to take my voice would die never hearing it again. Justice wears many faces. That night, back in my apartment, I felt hollow. Survival was no longer the only priority. I had endured, but now something deeper stirred. Purpose. Not just for the network, for myself. Maybe university wasn't as unreachable as I once thought. Elena called the next day. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell our story. We declined. Public attention would only force the practice deeper underground, make the girls harder to reach. We knew our work thrived best in the shadows, in silence turned strategic. Instead, we doubled down on expanding our mission. More than emergency escapes, we now offered job training, therapy referrals, and education scholarships. We weren't just rescuing girls anymore. We were helping them live.
Every girl who built a new life became living proof that the tradition's claims about feminine worth were lies. My acceptance letter arrived on the anniversary of my exile, admittance into a nursing program after 3 grueling years of prerequisite courses and full-time work. The girl who once ran with nothing would now become a medical professional. Maya would have been proud. The network no longer relied on my constant guidance. It had matured into something far greater than one person. New leaders stepped forward, bringing fresh ideas and renewed momentum. What began as my story had become ours, a chorus of voices louder than any attempt to silence them. I packed up my life again. But this time, it was by choice, not desperation. The apartment that had once been a sanctuary was now just a space I'd passed through. Growth meant letting go of safety, and I'd learned how to do that. I'd learned how to step into the unknown without fear. My final shift at the clinic ended with unexpected tears. The staff, once colleagues, now friends, had gathered to wish me luck. They'd hired another girl from the network to take my place. The cycle continued. Each success gave rise to another. Elena drove me to the university dorms. As we pulled into the lot, we sat in her car a moment longer, remembering the first frantic ride away from the world we'd known. The scared girl in the stained white dress had become someone neither of us could have imagined back then. Before I got out, Elena handed me a gift. Inside was a photo album. Hundreds of faces. Girls who had kept their voices. Girls who had escaped. Girls who had survived. Page after page of memory and defiance. My story stitched into every smile, every scar, every saved life. That night, I sat on my dorm bed and opened my anatomy textbook. I stopped at the chapter on vocal cords. Such small, fragile structures, yet they had meant everything. I traced the diagrams with my fingers, grateful for the voice I'd fought to keep. My phone buzzed. A message from a new girl asking for help. I forwarded it to the network, trusting the systems we had built to take care of her the way they once had taken care of me. What had started as survival had become an institution, a structure of hope born out of desperation. I thought of my father, still clinging to his bitter beliefs in exile, of my mother finding redemption in the soil of a memorial garden, of my sister, whose death had planted the seed of resistance in me. The tradition that had haunted generations was crumbling, not in a single blow, but one preserved voice at a time. Outside my window, I could hear students laughing, unaware of what it meant to fear silence. I envied their innocence, even as I cherished the resilience my scars had carved into me. Survival had been its own kind of education. Tomorrow would bring lectures and clinicals and more challenges. A life beyond escape. A future shaped not by what I'd endured, but what I chose to build. But tonight, I rested, balanced in the quiet space between what was and what could be. A girl with a voice, preparing to heal. The cutting tradition would linger in some corners of the world, kept alive by men like my father, those who mistook control for virtue. But for every girl silenced, more would resist, and the network would be there to catch them, to guide them, to help them build lives of their own choosing. I closed my textbook and turned off the light. In the morning, I would begin the next phase of an impossible journey, from voiceless daughter to healer of bodies, my grandmother's legacy of pain transformed into one of restoration. The work wasn't finished. It might never be. But every saved voice was a note in a song of defiance. And we had proven that together, even the quietest whispers could rise into a roar.